Thank you very much, Richard. And I'm very excited to be here with all of you. It's amazing to see the chat box and where you're all from. So I'm seeing Russia and Lithuania and Iran and Peru. So very, very excited to be here with you today. And, I'd love for you to engage in this presentation. And the way we can do this is through a tool called Nearpod. So if you have a mobile device with you, or you'd like to open another tab on your desktop, you can go to join.nearpod.com. And that's also, I believe, being placed in our chat box. If you go to join.nearpod.com, you will be prompted to put in a code. That code is 6QJLX. And this allows us to engage. So oftentimes I may ask some questions, and it allows you to post some answers within Nearpod. You will also be able to see the presentation within Nearpod, but you're also going to be able to see it through our webinar and your desktop here. So again, you can go to join.nearpod.com and put in this code 6QJLX. When prompted to put in your name, you can just put in your initials, so no worries. I see about 30 of you have already logged in, so that's fabulous. I'm going to go ahead and click this box off, but keep in mind you'll be able to see in the chat box the login information. And as soon as I click this X, you'll also be able to see this information in the upper left-hand corner of the presentation. Okay.
Christina, can I just Christina, we can't see your screen, I'm afraid. We can't see what you're showing on screen.
Okay, let's go back to that. Hopefully, are we all good now?
We can see the presentation. Yes, we can. We can see what you're showing on your screen.
You're able to see the Nearpod, yes?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. So up here in the upper left-hand corner, again, is that code. I see about 179 of you have joined. So I appreciate that. So let's get started and talking about critical thinking. Now, always whenever I give any kind of session, I'd love to hear what you want to walk away with today. So within Nearpod, for those of you who are logged in, you can click in this bottom box here and type your thoughts. If you're on a mobile device, you can hit that box and your keyboard will pop up. And I see some of you are already on it. So again, what do we want to walk away with today? Some inspiration, some new ideas, some knowledge of critical thinking, some practical info and tips. Ways to incorporate critical thinking, okay? Tips to help your kiddos think in the future. Love that one. Some ideas for lessons, practical exercises, okay? Techniques. Love these all, okay? Ideas to engage my students in critical thinking. Students to say, wow. Motivation and inspiration. All wonderful things. Okay, and I see we've actually maxed out here. Nearpod's maxing us out at 250. So all of these things, and hopefully I'm going to give you some new ideas, some inspiration, some practical tips. And always we want our students to be wowed, right? And to be successful. So let's just take a minute, and I'm going to just play the video here, okay? Actually, I'm going to allow you to play it also at your own pace. And as you watch this video, what I want you to think about is what's happening in that classroom. What's happening in that classroom?
Christina, I'm afraid the audio seems to be a problem. The audio is not coming through.
Okay, so I was playing that on some of your devices, so I'm sorry if you weren't able to hear that all. But from the image, you should have been able to see what was going on there. And so let's think about this. Let's do a little brainstorming here. What's the issue in that class? And have you, as an educator, experienced this? Okay, so you may have seen here that the students were searching for an answer that was in their textbook, right? So the students are puzzled. They're looking for the answer. The content's not on the syllabus. They expect to be spoon-fed, right? They're being asked to think, okay? Their doubts, their contextualizing, all of these are fantastic answers. The students are surprised not to be spoon-fed. They're being asked to think independently. And I'm sure like you, like myself, many of you have probably experienced this. You've probably experienced this. And really what this is critical thinking, or the lack of critical thinking in this case. Thinking beyond what's there. So just as we saw in this clip, students are often trained to look in a text. And this is especially true for students who walk into our classrooms, depending on the environments in which they had a foundation in education. So if the answer is not there black and white, as many of you said, spoon-fed, then they think, well, there's not an answer, right? And I was reminded of this just yesterday when a student came up to me after class and he said, very advanced student, great vocabulary, said he was really struggling being on campus. He didn't understand anything outside of the classroom. And I pressed him a little more and understood that he was really struggling with some idioms and figurative language. And when we break that down, really, what are we doing? The student's only seeing that those terms on the surface. They're not critically thinking through what could that mean in that situation. And somebody had put up on the board, contextualize, right? So how do we teach students to contextualize the content that they know, to use what they know and apply it in other situations and critically think through it, really going beyond what's in the text. And that's really what we're going to be exploring today. And we're going to do this through 3 guiding questions. That first one is, what is critical thinking exactly? I think we all have a sense just from that clip what critical thinking is, but we're going to look at it specifically in the ELT world. And why is it so important in the classroom, in the language classroom? Why is it so important? And what is the relationship between language, linguistic, academic literacy, and culture? So we're going to be breaking the literacies of critical thinking down by linguistic, academic, and cultural. So what is critical thinking? What is critical thinking? And I apologize that not more of you can join in on Nearpod, but those of you who are on Nearpod with me, if you don't mind giving me your definition of critical thinking. So I'll give you a minute here to kind of give me your definition of critical thinking. And we're seeing things like think beyond the book, okay? Thinking aloud, improvising. It's a mode of thinking about any subject, content, or problem. And I see this word analyzing, love that, assessing, reconstructing, not taking face value, deeper thinking. Here we go, reading between the lines, okay? Seeing beyond, thinking outside the box, again with the analysis, okay? Personal interpretation and perspective, right? A lot of thinking outside the box, probing beyond the surface, deducing information, lateral thinking, okay? Expanding, love that one, expanding horizons, own ideas and judging. Excellent. Okay. So we all have connecting the dots. Oh, that's so important in critical thinking, right? Connecting the dots, facts and opinions, applying logic. Okay. Making a connection. Yeah, I really enjoy that one as well. Being able to evaluate, going beyond the source. Okay. Asking why. Why? Okay. So important. The asking the why. So these are great ideas of critical thinking. And we could go on and on just looking at all your wonderful definitions. But let's look at a definition that I love. Now, this is an oldie but goodie. The ability of an individual to take charge of their own thinking and develop criteria and standards, appropriate criteria and standards for analyzing their own thinking. So it's really a complex process here that involves reflection, analysis, and evaluation. So when you take charge of your own thinking, you're reflecting, you're analyzing, and you're evaluating. And while this is an older definition, I still think it's a real goodie because of a phrase that appears in this definition twice: own thinking, right? And again, going beyond that textbook, going beyond what the professor might say. So when we think about this, building critical thinking in ELT can happen in practice, right? We can build critical thinking in a really deductive manner. And I think we want to take this just a step further in our own worlds, right? In our own ELT experiences. It's more about a mindset, an ideology. So what do I mean by that? Sometimes we adopt a method in our ELT teaching, right? And we also have a belief system, that ideology, what we believe works in the classroom, what we believe leads students to success. Critical thinking needs to be part of that ideology. Okay, we're really privileged in many of our cases to be surrounded by a plethora of diversity, cultures, language, previous learning experiences. We know diversity, I think, better than anybody else, right? So we need to develop this mindset around critical thinking. It needs to be part of our ideology. It needs to be what we believe to be true in language teaching. We can't leave critical thinking for others outside the EAP or ELT classroom, right? Especially if we are teaching EAP, if we are teaching students to be prepared to go into university. When our students leave us, they'll be thrown to the wolves as far as critical thinking is concerned. And so we have to embed critical thinking into our everyday methods, everyday approaches to teaching language. So really developing this own thinking has to be part of our process in developing language skills. There needs to be a global approach to learning and teaching. So we need to build that foundation in our classes. And to do that, let's get some ideas that you may have about critical thinking. So those of you who are able to interact in Nearpod, there's 3 questions here for you. Excuse me, and those of you who are not, we're going to go over these in a second. But they're myths and facts. So what could be a fact and what could be a myth about critical thinking? And when we talk about critical thinking, we definitely have lots of myths that surround the concept of critical thinking. What we believe to be true about critical thinking may not always be true about critical thinking, especially when we're teaching in an ELT classroom. And so I'll give you guys just another minute who are engaged here to go ahead and answer those questions. And then we'll look at these questions together, these myths and facts, and really unpack them and see how it applies to ELT. So I see we're just about, many of you have answered a good bit of them. So we'll see how we're doing here. Okay. So let's take this opportunity to look at some of those myths and facts. So the first question was, critical thinking can only be embedded in higher level EAP courses, myth or fact? And this is a myth, okay? We often think that students need a certain level of language to be able to get through some critical thinking tasks. And that's actually not the case at all. We want to build critical thinking from the very beginning. So I'm going to show you a couple sample activities today that can really be geared towards low-level language students, and getting them to build that critical thinking as they're building their language is going to be really necessary for their success beyond EAP. The second question was myth or fact. Critical thinking should take place at the end of a lesson after language has been taught. And this also is a myth. We want to build the critical thinking in as part of the linguistic language lesson, right? So, as you're teaching maybe, simple present, for example, you want to get students to think critically, maybe have them develop their own set of rules that go along with that structure. And that can happen at a very, very early level. And even providing sentence framers for the rules is a great way to build in critical thinking at those very, very early levels. And myth or fact, to teach critical thinking means to teach learning strategies. Not really. We're not teaching students how to find a main idea in a reading, or looking for vocabulary and context, right? Looking for clues within that reading. What we're teaching students to do with critical thinking is we're teaching them, again, to look beyond what's there, to use what they know about the language or know about any other subject to make inferences, right? To analyze it, to evaluate it. So not so much about learning strategies as general thinking strategies. Now, I want to take this just a step further when we talk about the ELT world, okay? So it's about informing every aspect of language teaching, not just a set of tools used from time to time. So what I mean by that, and we're all guilty of this as textbook developers and authors, right? So we might have a lesson, and then at the end of the lesson, we say, okay, here's the critical thinking task. But really building that critical thinking in every activity we do. And this could be as simple as asking students, what's going on here? What's really going on here? That's one of my favorite questions in the classroom. So as I'm teaching, what's going on here? Getting them to give me that back in their own words is building their ability to evaluate, right? It's building their ability to evaluate. So I love this quote as well. And the success of language learning depends less on materials, techniques, and linguistic analysis, and more on what goes on inside and between people in the classroom. So I think there's a tendency among teachers and students and people in general to believe that there's only one type of learning, right? And that we're just relying on this cognitive domain kind of activity. And I think when we think about critical thinking, we need to think not just about our cognitive domains, but our affective domains. And I'm going to go through each of these step by step. So when we think about the affective domains, we're including the manner in which we deal with things emotionally, right? Such as our feelings, our values, our appreciation, our motivation, and our attitudes. Motivation and attitude, as we all know as language educators, are critical for language teaching. They can bring great success or great failure into the classroom. So looking beyond, as educators too, we have to critically think and look beyond the materials that are there and look beyond the language structures that we're teaching to build critical thinking. So let's take it 2 steps further in ELT. And as I alluded to already, thinking about linguistic literacy, cultural literacy, and academic literacy. So taking that step further. So linguistic literacy obviously are language skills, right? We know we need to build those in the classroom. And then we have our academic literacy and our cultural literacy. So for me, it's the intersection of these 3 things that's really all about educating the whole language learner, the whole language learner. When I can build all 3 of these things, I can get students to really think critically. Okay, so we know if students are studying, if they're going to be in a Western system like the UK or US or Canada, the cultural expectations in these systems require learners not only to display linguistic literacy, but cultural and academic literacy. So as ELT educators, we have a real responsibility to prepare all literacies, all literacies. So exposing students to critical thinking tasks that are part of a contextualized language lesson prepares them for what lies beyond their EAP coursework and perhaps in their careers as well. So as we walk through and think about critical thinking, we need to think about all these literacies, right? All these literacies, because that will help us to build critical thinking. So some basic definitions here. Critical thinking and critical literacies. First, we'll talk about those linguistic literacies, really, which is about moving up Bloom's cognitive domains. And then those affective, or what I like to call academic literacies, that are really moving up the domains of those affective features. And then the culture's impact or influence. So we can't forget that last piece. So when we talk about Bloom's taxonomy, I'd like to first hear from you. What's the difference between these 2 tasks? So if you're in Nearpod, you'll be able to engage in it. If you're not, no worries. I'm going to put up the image here, so you should be able to see it. So here are 2 simple activities, 2 different ways of presenting some new content in the class, and very simple, just recreational activities here, like playing soccer, going fishing, going swimming. But take a look at that first gray box and that second gray box. And what do you see as the difference in these 2 tasks? So I'll be quiet for a second and let you kind of chew on this. So I'm seeing some things in the chat box that the second one's definitely more challenging, that the second one is building critical thinking, that, you know, fill in the blanks is very individual and very easy. So we're definitely getting the idea of these 2 kinds of activities, okay? So, you know, we have closed answers versus open creative answers. The second one uses guided discovery. Okay, absolutely. First one, you know, we have lots of visuals, so there's a lot of support and scaffolding here. The second task is getting students to infer things. Okay, absolutely, absolutely. First one gives an ideas for the second task where they can use their skills as well. Okay, so all great visuals here of these tasks. And we're going to visit these tasks again, but just what you can see there is they're both building the same kind of language, right? But they're building the language in very different ways. That first one is only really building language. The second one is building language and critical thinking. So to move into that, we're going to first talk about Bloom's taxonomy. And these are the cognitive domains, And so the cognitive domains are how we classify learning and thinking. And it moves from very low level here to high level, okay? And it's really interesting because when Bloom first developed this, he didn't refer to it as critical thinking. He referred to it as abilities and skills, right? Abilities and skills. And we've kind of morphed it into using the cognitive domains for critical thinking. But the goal there was to get beyond the remembering and understanding, to get beyond this. And so, you know, if this is used to design lessons, instructions, and even assessments, it really can build students' critical thinking alongside their language skills. So think of Bloom's as a staircase, right? In order to get to step 3, you need to take step 1 and 2 first. So first you need to remember it, then you need to understand it, then you can apply it. So we can't use new information until we really remember and understand it. And so thus, at learning's foundation is remembering and understanding. So let's take a simple example, maybe the past tense. In these first steps, we want students to remember and understand that regular forms we add ed. And activities like flashcards, matching, fill-ins are all great for remembering and understanding. But then maybe later we want students to write sentences about it in which they apply it, okay? So slowly moving them up the taxonomy is really preparing them to build that critical thinking. So at this point, evaluating and analyzing, they have to really think deeply about what they know about that skill or that language structure or function. So the critical thinking is going beyond those lower order skills. It's really a deeper understanding of language through deeper engagement. So going back to these 2 tasks again, the first one, we're definitely at that remembering and understanding phase. I'm not sure we're going beyond apply. Maybe when it says work in pairs, tell your partner what exercise or sport you like. That could be borderline applying, but to me, it's still a little bit of understanding, right? That they understand what those are. But if we look at that second task, okay, they're answering questions. Which sports or activities have 2 teams? So not only are they demonstrating what they remember and understand, but they're applying it, they're evaluating and analyzing as well. Okay, so that tells me if students truly understand, truly are using their critical thinking skills to work through that task. And then think of 5 other sports or activities. What verb would you use with each one? Now students are creating. They're not creating with the content that I have there, but they're creating using what they know about the content I have there, which is very different, okay? I think oftentimes we think create is to create with what we've taught. But in my mind, create and critical thinking are being able to use what they've learned and create something new with it. That's true critical thinking, and that's true learning. So going beyond. So some classroom strategies here for building those cognitive domains. It's really important that you identify your skill being taught and that students are aware of what's being taught. And then asking yourself, how do I move up Bloom's taxonomy with this to really deepen understanding and build critical thinking at the same time? Okay, so thinking about what's a good remember task, what's a good understand, what's a good apply, what's a good analyze, what's a good evaluate, what's a good create. If you're reviewing content, why not put analyze and evaluate together, or analyze, evaluate, and create together? Okay, so again, really thinking through the taxonomy here. So in your view, if you had to pick one word that describes the key to successful language learning, what would it be? One word. One word, the key to successful language learning. So again, if you're not able to engage on Nearpod, just go ahead and put it in the chat box for us. And I'm seeing things like motivation, motivation. On the board, I'm seeing enjoyment, patience, practice, enjoyment, thinking, effort, communicate, curiosity, passion, enthusiasm. Okay, all of these things, collaboration, awareness, curiosity. Excellent, excellent. Okay, so a lot of motivation, a lot of enthusiasm. Okay, I even see sense of humor popping in our chat box. The urge to communicate, engage, and engagement. Okay, love these. And that's probably where I'm going with as well. Okay, oh, we already saw that quote. Okay, so when we think about critical thinking and what motivates a student, or what's that key word for success, of course, we're going to think about engagement and we're going to think about motivation. Okay, so how motivated are students to truly learn? How motivated are they? And that really speaks to those affective domains, the affective domains. And with critical thinking, again, we need to build those cognitive domains, but we also need to build those affective domains, because we know how important motivation and engagement and enjoyment and fun and curiosity are for learning a language. Those all speak to those affective domains. So when we think about receiving, this really refers to a learner's sensitivity and willingness to receive and listen, right? Receive and listen, their willingness, okay? Are they motivated to listen? When we think about responding, we think about the learner's attention or motivation to respond, okay? To participate. Okay, when we think about valuing, this is about the learner's beliefs and attitudes, right? So how committed are they? I didn't see that word. I think if I did, I'm sorry, I apologize, I missed it. But how committed are they to learning? Then we think about organization. This refers to the learner's internalization, right? Of values and beliefs involving their value system. And how do we characterize their value system? So how are they prioritizing their learning? And then characterization here. This is the learner's highest level of affective domain. So are they fully integrating in it by participating regularly and consistently? So again, going to speaking of that engagement, how engaged are they? How engaged are they? So working on these domains is just important for our language learners. And I think we know this better than any other educators out there, right? We know the importance of engagement. We know the importance of motivation. And at the lowest level, we have the willingness to hear and listen to others. And that's so important in a university classroom, right? So if we're teaching in an EAP and our students need to go beyond that, we really want to make sure that they have a willingness to listen, and they can place that within their value system, and they can evaluate what's being said. And at the top level, group cooperation and revising thoughts based on what we hear. Again, a very strong critical thinking skill. So staging in your classroom group work and specific roles can really help students develop these skills beyond their EAP courses. So for example, some classroom strategies to build affective domains: role playing, simulations. Now let me give you a very specific of what I mean by simulations here. So in simulations, if you give students roles, not so much the language roles, but a little bit, because we're going to use functional language here. I might give students a role, you're going to present your opinion. I might give a second student a role, you're going to disagree with someone's opinion. Okay. A third student a role, you're going to support the student's opinion and try to convince student two to accept that opinion. These kinds of things are really important to build those affective domains. And we're going to see in a minute what the role culture plays in all of this. Okay, so we have very different perceptions of how we can agree and disagree with others. And having these simulations and giving students these kinds of opportunities to experience and play with language, but also build those affective domains can really help them to be successful beyond our classes. Journaling, getting students to write what they think and how they feel is so incredible. I teach a large cohort from Oman and Kuwait. And my students, the first time I had them do journals, I'm like, do not give me a summary. Tell me what you think about this. Tell me how how we're reading a novel called The Other Westmore. Tell me how his life would have been different if he wouldn't have done that. Okay, those activities are so challenging for my students, not because of the language. So many times we think they're going to be challenging because of the language. It's not the language. It's the critical thinking that we're asking students to do with the language. And so again, building those affective skills along with critical thinking, giving them reading materials, having them react, reflection papers. Anytime they have to really think and value and talk about behaviors, this is going to help them definitely build their critical thinking. And again, this can happen at a very, very, very low level of language, right? You can show a little movie clip and just ask them, you know, what happened and what would happen if the student didn't do X. Okay, so lots of strategies here to build that. So cognitive, we have our cognitive literacy and our affective literacy. Does that equal success in language learning when we think about critical thinking? Well, there's definitely another factor that we need. And the road to academic success is through critical thinking. But what if we don't know the culture of that road? Okay, so this is great if we build those cognitive domains and we build those affective domains. We're definitely building critical thinking there. But what if we don't know the culture of that road? Okay, so the culture is critical also in building critical thinking. So building that cultural literacy, and I realize there's a lot of text on here, and I've seen some things about the presentation available. I know it will be recorded, but I can always share my slides as well. So we need to teach the literacies and norms of our classroom, the norms of our classroom. So if we know our student's going to go to, you know, a Western English speaking university, what are the norms of that target classroom? That's what we need to teach as well. So when we're working on those cognitive domains and those affective domains, which of those domains are going to be most critical in their experience beyond us in their target classroom? So sometimes students think they're ready. They've taken every program available. They've passed all the standardized tests, and they have a great level of fluency, but they're shocked when they find themselves in university classes in a Western English speaking environment. They're not prepared for the lecture or the class discussion or the debate, right? Or the group work. They quickly become overwhelmed, right? And more importantly, they're shocked sometimes by their professors' expectations because they're very different than what they've experienced prior to that. And to us, they're second language learners, right? They're second language learners. But to their professors, they're just students who may not be prepared for that level of content, right? And so what we need to do is we need to build their cultural literacies, and this will also help build their critical thinking. So teaching them what does it mean to be an active participant, okay? How can you give your idea and elaborate on that idea, okay? Because that's what we expect in our Western English-speaking universities. So some classroom strategies. Consider your language groups. Think about where their strengths and where their weaknesses are. I know my populations that I'm teaching right now, my Omanis and my Kuwaitis, they're really good at giving me back everything that's in the textbook, okay? They're not so good at thinking beyond what's in the textbook, and they're not so good at managing group work. So when they are paired with native speakers, they become very intimidated. They don't know how to express their idea and elaborate. They don't think it's polite to do so. They don't think it's polite to question the professor. So understand those language groups you're teaching. Identify the differences and your students' comfort and discomfort levels, okay? I know my students are not comfortable working in groups. They would much rather be sitting in a lecture, listening to a professor and taking notes, okay? But when they're working in the groups, they have to have their linguistic literacies, their affective domains, and their cultural literacies as well. And then making sure that you design activities and practices that fill in those cultural gaps, okay? So, a lot of times, there's a lot happening right now in the US, okay? And so, social movements and this whole concept is not on their radar. So filling those cultural gaps as well. Now, why? Why is this all important? Well, when we thoughtfully design lessons and build and foster critical thinking skills, it makes for an ideal academic language program, one that goes beyond the linguistic factors by really providing students with a toolkit they need to be successful. So critical thinking for me is part of a student's toolkit. Not only do they need the structures and functions of the language, not only do they need to know how to be successful in the classroom, how those affective domains, their motivation, their engagement, but they need the tools to think critically, right? And that's all part of building those domains. So I think we have about 10 minutes left for questions. And I've seen a lot popping up, but I think I'm going to pass over to back to Richard to kind of initiate that the question and answer session. And I see some questions there for some practical ideas. Yes, our next, this is a 4-part webinar series, and our next session will focus strictly on how to teach critical thinking. So I will share with you several tasks and activities, very similar to the brief ones we saw today, to really embed those critical thinking lessons into your classroom. And they'll be divided by skill level and content area as well.
And just to say, that will be on the 3rd of February, Wednesday, the 3rd of February at the same time, which is 2 p.m. UK time, 3 p.m. European time.
So I see another question about practical tips for critical thinking online. There are so many things that you can do online, and I think online, actually, virtual environments lend themselves to building critical thinking, maybe even more so than some of our classroom environments, because the mode itself, students have to critically think through. And so just off the top of my head, you can do lots of partner activities in an online environment, depending on the tools that you're using. For example, you can, if you're using a learning management system like Canvas or Blackboard, getting students to pair in groups in that digital environment and negotiate through that process itself can really help build some critical thinking tasks. I will definitely build some online activities into our next session on the 3rd.
Christina, one of the questions that came through at the same time was, how do we teach culture without imposing our own opinions?
That's a fantastic question, right? I think when I say culture and when I say cultural literacy, what I mean is the culture of that classroom, the culture of the academic institution in which that student will be studying. Okay, whether it's the UK, US, Canada, or wherever, right? We have to have a good understanding of that target environment to be able to adequately prepare students for that environment. So I think without, if we look at that environment, we can be very objective about it, right? We may not put in our own ideas as much there. So we're not really teaching the culture as much as the environment. What do students need to be ready with? What do they need to be prepared for in that environment?
Thank you. We also have another question, which is around how does the language barrier affect someone's critical thinking?
That's a great question. And that's why I always start with that in my myths. Okay. I think we can teach someone to critically think with very, very little language skills, right? So even at those beginning levels, getting them to think through a task, getting students, you could even start so simple with pictures, and they have just pictures and they could categorize those pictures. Believe it or not, that's critical thinking. When we ask students to put things in categories, they have to critically think. They have to do some evaluation, some analysis, and then they can put them in the category. So it could be 0-level language. We could use just pictures and begin categorizing. And again, I think we don't want to dismiss it at those early levels. We want it to become second nature to our students when they enter into our academic programs.
Thank you. And we have another question. Somebody who comments around how critical thinking, has been around, obviously in different guises for a long time. And the commenter mentions, it was taught it 35 years ago. Why do you think there's a sudden or new interest across school programs now?
That's a great question as well. And I think that if you've been teaching in an EAP program, we're seeing new populations come up. We're seeing this new generation, okay? This digital native generation where information is instantly at their fingertips, right? All they have to do is ask Siri or Google something, and they have what they need. So I think this generation, I'm sad to say, probably lacks critical thinking more so than the previous generations. I know my own daughter, well-educated, but if she can't find the answer on Google or Siri, it's hard for her to critically think through how to resolve that issue, right? So for many of us who grew up in a world before the internet, we had to really critically think through everything we did, right? Whether it was doing a research paper at the library or, finding, a way to call our parents when we didn't have mobile devices. These are all critical thinking things. And this digital generation, they constantly have information at their fingertips. So whatever they want, they can easily access it. So I think it becomes more important today to teach critical thinking than in the past. Because again, these students have immediate access to information. And so really teaching them to use their skills to find other ways to evaluate and create are very, very important. Thank you, Christina.
I don't know if there are any other questions that have come along. There's one I just see about how about countries who don't even have Google? Yeah, basically agreeing essentially with what you're commenting on. So I think with that, I'll thank you again, Christina, for taking us through critical thinking, a great introduction to the topic. And thank you all for attending both on Click Meeting, and I'm sorry for those of you who couldn't get into Click Meeting and onto Nearpod, but onto Click Meeting, and I hope you enjoyed this through Facebook Live. So with that, I'll just say that the next webinar, which is on Build Success Beyond the Classroom, How to Teach Critical Thinking, will be at the same time on the 3rd of February. And you can sign up for the webinar at english.com/experiences. So with that, I'll say goodbye and thank you very much.